Welcome to New York City. The year is 1933. You are standing in the heart of what was, just 4 years ago, the richest city on the face of the earth. Look around. The skyline here is like nothing the world has ever seen, with towers of steel and glass reaching higher than anywhere else, monuments built to celebrate an age of endless prosperity. The Empire State Building, finished just 2 years ago, stands 1,454 feet tall, the tallest structure ever built by human hands. But here is the thing. Right now, more than half of its offices sit completely empty. They call it the Empty State Building, and that tells you everything you need to know about what happened to this city. 4 years ago, everyone in New York wanted to get rich. Bankers, factory workers, shoe shiners, they were all buying stocks, convinced that the good times would never end. The champagne was flowing, the jazz bands were playing, and money seemed to grow on trees. Today, those same people are standing in lines that stretch around entire city blocks, waiting for a bowl of free soup and a piece of bread. Today, almost 1 million New Yorkers have no job, no savings, and in many cases, no hope. This is the Great Depression. And this is the story of how the greatest city in the world is fighting to survive. To understand how New York fell so far, so fast, you have to go back to a single week in October of 1929. For most of the 1920s, Wall Street had been the engine of American dreams. The stock market seemed to only go up, and ordinary people who had never invested a dime in their lives were suddenly borrowing money to buy shares in companies they had never heard of. They called it buying on margin, and it worked beautifully as long as prices kept rising. But prices do not rise forever. On Thursday, October 24th, 1929, the bubble finally burst. It started in the morning, with a few nervous investors selling their shares. Then a few more. Then a flood. By noon, the floor of the New York Stock Exchange had descended into pure chaos, with traders screaming, papers flying through the air, and grown men weeping openly as they watched their fortunes evaporate in real time. They called it Black Thursday. But the worst was yet to come. The following Tuesday, October 29th, the market collapsed completely. In a single day, investors lost $14 billion, which in today's money would be over $250 billion. Banks that had lent money to stock speculators suddenly found themselves with nothing. Exposed, broken. One by one, they began to fail. And when the banks failed, they took the savings of ordinary Americans down with them. Factory owners, suddenly unable to get credit, laid off their workers by the thousands, then by the hundreds of thousands. The ripple became a wave, and the wave became a tsunami that would drown the entire American economy for the next decade. By 1933, the year we are visiting, the damage is staggering. National unemployment has reached 25%. 1 in 4 American workers has no job. In New York City alone, the number of unemployed has climbed past 1 million. And those are just the official numbers. The real figure is almost certainly higher. The city that symbolized American success now symbolizes American suffering. But New Yorkers are not the kind of people who give up easily. And that is what makes this story worth telling. And yet, even in the depths of this crisis, New York City remains a place of stunning contradictions. If you look up, you will see the most breathtaking skyline that humanity has ever constructed. The Chrysler Building, completed just 3 years ago in 1930, still gleams with its stainless steel crown, a monument to Art Deco elegance that catches the sunlight and refuses to apologize for its beauty. The Empire State Building, finished in 1931, towers over everything else. a cathedral of capitalism rising 102 stories into the sky. The George Washington Bridge, which opened just 2 years ago, stretches across the Hudson River like a ribbon of steel, connecting Manhattan to New Jersey in a feat of engineering that seemed impossible just a decade earlier. These structures were designed to celebrate prosperity, to announce to the world that New York was the center of modern civilization. But now they stand as monuments to a party that ended too soon, like decorations from a celebration that nobody remembers how to continue. If you look down, however, you will see a very different city. The streets that once overflowed with automobiles and well-dressed businessmen are now crowded with a different kind of traffic. On nearly every corner of Midtown, you will find men in threadbare suits selling apples for 5 cents apiece. These are not career street vendors. These are former accountants, former salesmen, former factory supervisors, men who once earned good salaries and supported families, now reduced to peddling fruit just to scrape together enough coins for dinner. At the peak of the apple-selling phenomenon, there are more than 6,000 of these vendors scattered across Manhattan alone. The apples come from the International Apple Shippers Association, which sells them on credit to the unemployed, who then try to resell them at a small profit. It is not much of a living, but it is better than begging. It allows a man to tell himself that he is still working, still providing, still holding on to some fragment of dignity in a world that seems determined to strip it away. The factories that once powered this city are falling silent, one by one. In the garment district, where hundreds of thousands of workers once operated sewing machines from dawn until dusk, production has been slashed in half. The shipyards along the waterfront, which used to echo with the sounds of hammers and welding torches, now sit eerily quiet, their cranes frozen in place like the skeletons of prehistoric creatures. Construction, which had been booming throughout the 20s as developers raced to build ever-taller skyscrapers, has ground to a near standstill. Why build new office towers when the existing ones cannot find tenants? Why hire workers when there is no work to be done? The numbers tell a story of devastation that is almost impossible to comprehend. In 1929, before the crash, unemployment in the United States stood at roughly 3%. By 1933, it has exploded to nearly 25%. In New York City, the situation is even worse in some neighborhoods, with entire blocks where not a single family has a steady income. And then there are the Hoovervilles. If you walk into Central Park, past the manicured lawns and elegant fountains, you will eventually come upon a sight that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. Scattered among the trees and along the edges of the great lawn, hundreds of makeshift shelters have sprung up, constructed from wooden crates, scraps of metal, old newspapers, and anything else that desperate hands could find. These shantytowns have appeared in cities all across America, and the people have given them a bitter, mocking name, calling them Hoovervilles, after President Herbert Hoover, the man many blame for failing to stop the economic collapse. The largest Hooverville in New York stretches across a dried-up reservoir in Central Park, home to dozens of families who have lost everything, their former lives as distant as a half-remembered dream. They cook over open fires, collect rainwater for drinking, and try to maintain some semblance of normal life, even as the towers of Fifth Avenue loom in the distance, tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far away. But even as the people of New York struggle to survive, the winds of political change are beginning to blow through the corridors of power. For 3 long years, President Herbert Hoover has presided over this disaster, and the American public has run out of patience. Hoover, a man who once symbolized competence and prosperity, has become the most despised figure in the nation, his name synonymous with failure, his face a reminder of broken promises and empty reassurances. In November of 1932, the voters deliver their verdict with crushing finality. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the governor of New York, defeats Hoover in a landslide that reshapes the political landscape of America. Roosevelt carries 42 of the 48 states, winning the Electoral College by a margin of 472 to 59. It is not merely a victory. It is a repudiation of everything that came before, a desperate cry from a nation that is willing to try anything, trust anyone, embrace any promise of change. On March 4, 1933, Roosevelt takes the oath of office on the steps of the Capitol, and he delivers words that will echo through history. "The only thing we have to fear," he declares, "is fear itself." 2. It is a message aimed directly at a nation paralyzed by uncertainty, a call to action for a people who have forgotten how to hope. Roosevelt promises a New Deal for the American people, a sweeping program of government intervention designed to put people back to work, stabilize the banking system, and restore confidence in the economy. Here in New York City, there is also change on the horizon at the local level. Fiorello LaGuardia, a fiery reformer with a reputation for fighting corruption, is preparing his campaign for mayor. By the end of this very year, he will win that election and begin transforming New York into a cleaner, more efficient, more honest city. But for now, in the spring of 1933, New Yorkers are simply waiting, watching, hoping that this time the promises will be kept. The economy of New York in 1933 exists in a state of suspended animation, frozen somewhere between collapse and recovery, with nobody quite certain which direction things will go. The banking system, which forms the very backbone of modern commerce, has essentially ceased to function. In the 4 years since the crash, more than 9,000 banks across the United States have failed, taking the life savings of millions of ordinary Americans down with them. People who worked their entire lives, who saved every spare penny, who did everything right, have watched their money simply vanish, gone forever into the void of institutional failure. By March of 1933, the situation has become so dire that Roosevelt takes the extraordinary step of declaring a national bank holiday, forcing every bank in the country to close its doors for an entire week, while the government figures out which institutions are healthy enough to survive and which must be allowed to perish. For the average New Yorker, daily life has become an exercise in careful calculation and constant anxiety. A factory worker, if he is fortunate enough to have a job at all, might earn around $15 per week, though many earn far less than that. A loaf of bread costs about 8 cents. A quart of milk runs around 14 cents. A pound of ground beef can be had for perhaps 12 cents. These prices might seem affordable on paper, but when you have no income at all, when your savings have evaporated and your prospects have dried up, even 8 cents for bread becomes an impossible sum. Across the city, charitable organizations have established what they call breadlines and soup kitchens, places where the hungry can receive a free meal without having to pay a single cent. The lines at these establishments stretch around city blocks, sometimes containing thousands of people who stand for hours in the cold, waiting for a bowl of watery soup and a chunk of stale bread. For many proud men and women who once considered themselves middle class, joining these lines represents a humiliation almost too painful to bear. Yet they join anyway, because the alternative is watching their children go to bed hungry. Despite all of this suffering, or perhaps because of it, the people of New York have developed a remarkable capacity for resilience and mutual support. In the tenement buildings of the Lower East Side, in the brownstones of Brooklyn, in the apartment blocks of the Bronx, Neighbors look out for one another in ways that would have seemed unnecessary during the prosperous 20s. Families share whatever food they have, passing plates across hallways, making sure that no child on their floor goes completely without. Landlords, many of whom are struggling themselves, sometimes look the other way when tenants cannot make rent, understanding that evicting a family onto the street helps nobody. Churches and synagogues have become centers of community support, organizing clothing drives, distributing donated food, providing a place where people can gather and remind themselves that they are not alone in their struggles. The children of the Depression learn lessons that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. They learn to waste nothing, to save everything, to find creative solutions to impossible problems. They learn that security is an illusion, that fortune can turn on a dime, that the only things you can truly count on are the people who love you. Many of these children will grow up to become the parents and grandparents who built the American middle class of the post-war era, and they will carry the scars of these lean years forever, refusing to throw away food, saving rubber bands and bits of string, always keeping a little cash hidden away, just in case the world falls apart again. But they will also carry something else, something harder to define, a quiet pride in having survived, in having made it through the worst and come out the other side still standing. And yet, even in the darkest times, human beings find ways to dream. In 1933, while breadlines snake through the streets and families ration every morsel of food, the movie theaters of New York are packed with audiences hungry for escape. For just 25 cents, a working man can forget his troubles for 2 hours, losing himself in a world of glamour, adventure, and happy endings that seem impossible in real life. This is the year that King Kong premieres at Radio City Music Hall, thrilling audiences with the spectacle of a giant ape climbing the Empire State Building, swatting at airplanes, and falling hopelessly in love with a beautiful woman. The film is a sensation, breaking box office records and giving New Yorkers something to talk about besides unemployment and bank failures. There is something almost poetic about it, this fantasy of a mighty creature brought low by forces beyond his control, displayed for the entertainment of crowds in the very city that is itself struggling to survive. Radio City Music Hall itself is a symbol of defiant optimism, having opened its doors just 1 year earlier in 1932 as part of the Rockefeller Center complex. The theater seats nearly 6,000 people and features a stage so enormous that entire orchestras can rise up from below the floor on hydraulic platforms. It is a palace of entertainment built during the worst economic crisis in American history, a statement that New York still believes in its own future even when the present looks bleak. Up in Harlem, the jazz clubs continue to swing despite everything. The Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, and dozens of smaller venues still fill with music every night, offering both black and white New Yorkers a chance to dance away their sorrows. Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway are the kings of this scene, their orchestras producing sounds so joyful and so alive that, for a few hours at least, the Depression seems very far away. Mae West is scandalizing audiences with her suggestive wit, and the Marx Brothers are making people laugh until their sides ache. Entertainment is not a luxury in times like these. It is medicine. But perhaps no event in 1933 captures the mood of cautious celebration, quite like what happens in December. For 13 long years, since January of 1920, the United States has lived under prohibition, a nationwide ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. The law was meant to create a more moral, more productive society, but instead it gave birth to a vast criminal empire that has corrupted police departments, enriched gangsters, and turned ordinary citizens into lawbreakers every time they ordered a drink at a speakeasy. Here in New York, prohibition has been particularly absurd, with an estimated 30,000 illegal drinking establishments operating throughout the city, more than 3 times the number of legal saloons that existed before the ban. Everyone knows where to find a drink if they want one. The only question is whether you will be paying a bartender or a mobster. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment to the Constitution is ratified, repealing prohibition once and for all. The news spreads through New York like wildfire, and within hours the celebrations begin. Bars that have been operating illegally suddenly become legitimate businesses. Breweries that have been producing near beer with almost no alcohol content can finally make the real thing again. Restaurants can serve wine with dinner without fear of a police raid. It is a small victory in the grand scheme of things, a symbolic moment rather than a solution to any real problem, but it matters nonetheless. After years of bad news, after years of watching everything fall apart, New Yorkers finally have something to toast. The criminal organizations that grew fat on illegal booze will not disappear overnight, of course, but their stranglehold on the city has been loosened, and that is something worth celebrating. As the year draws to a close, there are other reasons for cautious optimism. Roosevelt's New Deal programs are beginning to take effect, putting thousands of unemployed Americans back to work on public projects. The Civilian Conservation Corps is sending young men into the forests and parks to plant trees, build trails, and earn a small wage that they can send home to their struggling families. The Public Works Administration is funding the construction of roads, bridges, and public buildings, creating jobs in the construction industry that has been devastated since the crash. Here in New York, plans are being drawn up for new infrastructure projects that will transform the city over the coming decade. None of this will end the Depression overnight. The road to recovery will be long and difficult, with setbacks and disappointments still to come. But for the first time in 4 years, there is a sense that perhaps the worst has passed, that perhaps the country has finally hit bottom and can begin the slow climb back toward something resembling normal life. The New Yorkers walking these streets in 1933 have no way of knowing what the next decade will bring. They cannot see that the recovery they are hoping for will be slow, painfully slow, with unemployment remaining stubbornly high throughout the rest of the 30s. They cannot know that in just 6 years, in the spring of 1939, this very city will host the most ambitious World's Fair ever attempted, a spectacular celebration called the World of Tomorrow that will draw 44 million visitors to Flushing Meadows in Queens. That fair will showcase television, robots, and futuristic highways, offering Americans a glimpse of a prosperity that still seems impossibly distant in 1933. The fairgrounds will feature a massive white sphere and a towering spire that will become symbols of hope, monuments to the belief that better days are always ahead if we have the courage to build them. But the people of 1933 also cannot see the shadow that is gathering across the Atlantic Ocean. In Germany, a new leader has just risen to power, a man named Adolf Hitler, who took office as Chancellor in January of this very year. Most New Yorkers pay little attention to events in Europe, consumed as they are with their own struggles, their own survival. They do not yet understand that this distant political development will eventually reach across the ocean and touch every family in America. Within 8 years, the United States will be drawn into a global conflict that will demand sacrifices beyond anything the Depression ever required. Many of the young men who are today standing in breadlines, who are selling apples on street corners, who are growing up in crowded tenements with empty stomachs, will find themselves shipped overseas to fight in places they have never heard of. Some of them will not come back. The Depression will finally end, but it will be replaced by something even more terrible: a world at war that will test the limits of human endurance and reshape the map of nations. And yet, when the dust finally settles, when the Depression fades into memory and the conflict ends in victory, something remarkable will emerge from all that suffering. The reforms enacted during these desperate years will transform American society in ways that last for generations. The banking regulations put in place after the crash of '29 will prevent another collapse for nearly 80 years. Social Security, signed into law in 1935, will provide a safety net for elderly Americans that exists to this day. The labor protections, the unemployment insurance, the minimum wage, all of these foundations of modern American life trace their origins back to this moment, back to the lessons learned when the richest nation on earth watched its people go hungry. The physical legacy of the Depression is still visible in New York City today. The Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, Rockefeller Center, the George Washington Bridge, these masterpieces of Art Deco architecture were all built during the crisis years, monuments to the audacious belief that the future was still worth investing in even when the present seemed hopeless. If you walk through Central Park today, past the manicured lawns and well-maintained paths, there is almost no trace of the Hoovervilles that once stood there, no physical reminder of the families who huddled in makeshift shelters while the towers of Fifth Avenue loomed overhead. The shame has been erased, paved over, forgotten by a city that prefers to remember its triumphs rather than its tragedies. But the memory lives on in the stories passed down through generations, in the habits of thrift and caution inherited from grandparents who never forgot what it meant to have nothing. If you stand today in Times Square, surrounded by flashing lights and rushing crowds, you are standing on the same ground where desperate men once sold apples for 5 cents, where families lined up for hours just to receive a bowl of soup, where an entire generation learned that tomorrow is never guaranteed. New York survived the Depression. It survived because its people refused to give up, because they helped each other when no one else would, because they found ways to laugh and dance and dream even when the world seemed to be falling apart. The towers still stand. The subways still run. The city still pulses with the same restless energy that has defined it for centuries. And somewhere, in every New Yorker who has ever faced hard times and kept going anyway, the spirit of 1933 lives on.